And thank you very much, Professor Sharma. I'm very grateful to Indus University and the Center for Indic Studies for giving me this opportunity to present my views on wokeness and postmodernism. These are themes.
Now here's the way of playing. So you want to keep the play proper.
Sorry, I was getting some noise at my end. So anyway, to resume, these are themes that I've been investigating and exploring for some time now. And as Ankur has told you already, the areas I work on are intellectual and cultural history, and wokeness and postmodernism both pertain to intellectual history, both pertain to history of ideas, and history of ideas is something that I'm very interested in. So before I begin my talk, let me tell you how I've structured it. I intend to speak for about 45 odd minutes, after which we can have a discussion amongst us. Since I'm a historian, since I'm a student of history, since I'm a historian by training, what I'll be primarily mainly dwelling on is actually the history of wokeness and the history of postmodernism and the forces which brought the two together, which melded the two. So where do we begin? How do we begin? What is wokeness? What do we mean when we use the word woke? Woke is a current urban slang. It denotes, it suggests a certain tendency. What is this tendency? Wokeness is the tendency for advocacy. It is another term, or rather a shortened term, for advocacy culture. What do we mean by advocacy culture? It is the tendency to take up this or that cause, ostensibly for the good of society. Where do the roots of advocacy culture lie? The roots of advocacy culture lie in liberalism, in liberal thought. It is actually a derivative, it is actually a modulation of liberal thought. And how did liberal thought come to fuel advocacy culture? To understand this, we have to go back to the very roots, to the very beginnings of liberalism, and understand how liberalism progressed down the centuries, and how did it assume the current form, that is the woke culture, the advocacy culture that we see around us. So how did liberalism originate? Let us go to the roots of the very beginnings of liberalism. To the extent that I've been studying liberal thought and the progression of liberal thought, I would say that liberalism originated, or liberalism began, as a very radical reimagining of the state, a very radical reimagining of the state and the society. And who was the first person to do this? I would say that the very first person, the very first individual to do this was John Locke in the 17th century. Locke engaged with a text which was current in those days. The name of this text is Patriarcha. It was authored by someone called Sir Robert Filmer, who came from the English aristocracy, apparently. Now, in this text named Patriarcha, Sir Robert Filmer argued that royal sovereignty is actually a derivative of the patriarchal authority, which God ostensibly, supposedly invested in Adam, the first man. Locke argued against this proposition. John Locke said that no, it can't be so. And what were the premises, what were the bases on which he made his argument? He said that royal sovereignty cannot be a derivative of the patriarchal authority that God supposedly invested in Adam, because God gave authority, if he did give authority to Adam at all, it was only over his own family. It was not over the realm at large. It was not over nature at large. But a king, paraphrasing Locke here, I would say that a king enjoys authority over the realm, over nature as well. And Locke dismissed that this authority is divinely ordained. And secondly, Locke said that even if God did invest patriarchal authority in Adam, he did not renew this authority thereafter in the subsequent generations. So we cannot say that royal sovereignty is a derivative of the patriarchal authority that Adam supposedly inherited from God and enjoyed over his family. So what conclusion can we draw? What conclusion can be drawn from Locke's arguments? Locke basically was arguing that royal sovereignty is not divinely ordained. He was arguing against this idea that royal absolutism is divinely ordained. He was dismissing this idea of a divinely ordained royal absolutism. What did Locke do instead? He actually reimagined the royal sovereignty. He reimagined the state or the Commonwealth as an instrument of social utility. All of you or most of you here must be familiar with this argument that Locke presented or propounded. Locke argued that human beings, in order to secure their liberty and property, merge their liberty and property in the social body, just so that their liberty and property are guaranteed, both are secured. This is how he argued the state or the Commonwealth come into existence. So he reimagined the state, he reimagined royal authority, royal sovereignty as an instrument of a social utility, as a guarantor of rights to liberty and property. The same was done by another political thinker, Thomas Hobbes. He too reimagined the state as an instrument of social utility. Thomas Hobbes, again, I think in the same century, in the 17th century, argued that human beings are motivated by two dominant influences, appetites and aversions. There are things that we desire, there are things that we like, that is appetites, and there are things that we want to avoid, which are our aversions. And these appetites and aversions animate the nerves, muscles, memories, logic, and reason in the human body. Now, Hobbes argued that the dominant human appetite is for power. He interpreted power as the liberty to do oneself good. And how did he interpret liberty? He understood liberty as freedom from external influence. Now, since he believed, or as understood by him, struggle for power was incessant. It was continuous in the state of nature. It was just continuous. It was all the time. And as a result of this, life was nasty, short, and brutish. This is a very famous phrase employed, used by Thomas Hobbes. Most people must be familiar with it. Most of the audience must be familiar with it. So due to this incessant and continuous struggle for power in the state of nature, life was nasty, short, and brutish. So what did human beings do? Once again, they merged, or rather they alienated some liberty to the state, into the Commonwealth, just so that everyone enjoys the same amount of liberty. And this is how the state or the Commonwealth came into existence. So once again, the state or the Commonwealth was reimagined as an instrument of social utility. Just as John Locke did, Thomas Hobbes did the same. Then in the 18th century, Jeremy Bentham added another further dimension to liberal thought, to the development, to the progression of liberal thought. Jeremy Bentham argued that human beings are dominated by two forces, pain and pleasure. And on the basis of this argument, on the basis of this supposed insight, he developed his doctrine of utility, which we popularly commonly term utilitarianism. So on the basis of this insight that human beings are motivated or dominated by these two forces, pleasure and pain, Jeremy Bentham developed his doctrine of utility, or as he termed it, the doctrine of general happiness. He concluded, or rather he argued, that it is the job of the state to reward initiatives which promote pleasure and punish initiatives which cause pain. And later, of course, he tried to guide and help legislation by doing a survey of the motivations, the objectives from which initiatives or acts causing pain emerge. Then came Rousseau. Rousseau tried to understand the grounds on which sovereignty could be contested. And like John Locke, he too understood the state as an instrument of a social utility. He too, like John Locke, argued that the human beings merge their liberty and property in the social body and thus create the state of the Commonwealth. Of course, his argument was slightly inflected, slightly differently from John Locke's, in the sense that he believed or he understood that the initiative for this merger is taken by the elite. So in a way, he implied that the state is an elite entity, or the Commonwealth is an elite entity. And of course, which this is something that you must be familiar with. He furthered the argument that sovereignty is the outcome of outcome of a social contract. When human beings merge their liberty and property in the social body, they're forming a social contract with the state. And the deal is that the state guarantees liberty and property of the citizenry, of the subjects. And of course, he implied that if the state is not keeping its part of the bargain, if the state is not guaranteeing the liberty and property of its subjects or citizens, its sovereignty can be contested. Then came Thomas Paine. Please note that I am walking you through the progression, the evolution of liberal thought down the centuries, with reference to the major liberal thinkers. So Rousseau was followed by Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine was a radical. Rousseau too was a radical in certain senses, but Thomas Paine was a greater radical. Thomas Paine argued that hereditary royal succession is not necessarily legitimate. In fact, he was much influenced, he was much inspired by the ideal of the French Revolution. So he argued that hereditary royal succession is not necessarily legitimate, and it could be proper for human beings. It could be proper for the subject population, for the citizenry, to bring about a revolutionary change, revolutionary transformation of government. He was actually engaging against Edmund Burke, who made a very negative assessment of the French Revolution. He saw it as an instance of rebellion and regicide. But Thomas Paine instead argued that the French Revolution was actually an instance of people rationally contemplating their rights and undertaking revolutionary action. More importantly, or rather equally importantly, Thomas Paine propounded a very radical theory of rights, which you once again must be familiar with. A lot of you, or most of you, must be familiar with. He argued, or rather he suggested, that there are two varieties of rights that human beings ought to enjoy, ought to be granted two varieties of rights. First, social rights. And he argued that these are rights which human beings ought to enjoy by sheer virtue of being human beings. And in instance, an example of this right would be the right to the pursuit of happiness, a very famous phrase, the pursuit of happiness. And the second set of rights that he imagined were civil rights, which apparently were to be enjoyed by human beings by virtue of being members of a social body. For example, the right to express their opinions. So here we have two very important, very vital radical ideas. The first, that human beings might legitimately change governments by undertaking revolutionary action, and that there are certain inalienable rights which are to be bestowed upon, which are to be extended to human beings. Then came by J.S. Mill, who developed liberal thought in the contours, in the form that we are familiar with today. He first developed the doctrine of liberty, or the idea of liberty. He argued that liberty means that there are certain guarantees that human beings enjoy against the authority of the state, that state authority, that governmental authority ought not to be untrammeled, unqualified upon human beings. There should be some checks, some limits upon governmental authority upon human beings. And then he argued that human beings ought to have the right to freely express themselves, that no ideas, no opinions should be sacrosanct or considered infallible. Every idea, every opinion must be challenged. It is necessary to challenge every idea, every opinion. And then he went on to say that just as the state must not enjoy untrammeled authority over human beings, the society too must not enjoy untrammeled, unqualified authority over human beings. He argued, he suggested that there should be limits upon the authority enjoyed by the social body upon an individual, and that society should have no authority over an individual unless an individual's actions are inimical to the social body. And then he said, and then he wrote, he argued that representative government or democracy is the best form of government because it promotes utility or general happiness. It trains the human character, it trains human beings in the art of governance. Finally, J.S. Mill also critiqued the most intimate of human social domains, the domain of marriage, the domain of conjugality. He offered the first, in my opinion, the first detailed critique of the institution of a Christian marriage. He critiqued the Christian marriage vows, for instance. He compared traditional European conjugality or Christian conjugality to bond slavery. He said that they reduce that traditional Christian marriage vows reduce a woman to the status of a bond slave in relation to her husband, because they enjoy complete obedience on the part of the woman towards her husband. So I have briefly taken you through the development and the progression of liberal thought down the centuries. Now let us form a few conclusions. Let us see what are the things that liberal thought is insinuating, is suggesting by the 19th century, what form liberal thought has taken, and what arguments it is implying, it is implicitly furthering by the 19th century. First, liberal thought reimagined the state as an instrument of social utility, as a guarantor of liberty and property rights, and not a moralizing agent or a manifestation of the spirit. Think of the Hegelian idea of the state. Secondly, liberal thought made the state responsible for general happiness, for the general happiness of the social body and individual human beings. Thirdly, this is very vital as far as understanding wokeness is concerned. Thirdly, liberal thought identified the state and society as a potential grounds for activist interventions. Think of Thomas Paine here. For instance, human beings could undertake revolutionary transformations or revolutionary change of governments. They could legitimately demand liberty, freedom of speech, representative government, etc. from their states and societies. Finally, and fourthly, liberalism now displayed the tendency to criticizing the traditional social affections. Social affection is a phrase that I've borrowed from the conservative thinkers, Sir Roger Scruton. Family, for example, is a traditional social affection as understood by Sir Roger Scruton. So the social affection the traditional social affection that liberal thought critiqued in the 19th century was marriage, traditional Christian marriage. So these are the aspects that liberal thought had assumed by the 19th century, and all of these are very vital from the point of view of wokeness, if we set out to understand wokeness. By the 19th century, or rather by the end of the 19th century, liberal thought had also began to assume a more liberal pitch. It was raising itself to a more liberal register, so to speak. There is this thinker, political thinker, who is, I think, more or less unheard of today, and generally not read. He has been more or less forgotten. The name of this political thinker is Thomas Hill Green. I would say that Thomas Hill Green was the political thinker who inflected liberalism towards a more radical direction, once again laying the premises of what we understand, what we see as wokeness today. Thomas Hill Green, for example, argued that it is in the duty of the state to remove obstacles in the path of the moral development of human beings, and also it is the duty of the state to create opportunities. So liberalism, as I've said already, liberalism was inflecting itself in a more radical direction. It was raising itself to a more radical pitch. So once again, to borrow an idea from the political thinker Mearsheimer, the traditional modus vivendi liberalism was now developing into progressive liberalism. The moral premises of progressive liberalism were being laid by the end of the 19th century. And this is vital from the point of view of the roots, the foundations of wokeness. So liberalism, once again, to reprise certain conclusions that I've presented before you, liberalism now identified a certain moral premises on the basis of which human beings could make demands, supposedly, ostensibly legitimate demands upon their states and societies. And what is, once again, wokeness? Wokeness is the advocacy tendency. And what does the advocacy tendency amount to? It amounts to making incessant, continuous demands upon state and society. It amounts to the belief that state and society are legitimate sites, legitimate locations for activist intervention. And this idea, or the premises of this idea, were laid in the 19th century by the 19th century by liberal thought. As to how, I've tried to demonstrate that before you by walking you through the history of the development and progression of liberal thought. So what is the conclusion that I'm presenting before you at this point in my talk? Once again, let me reprise the conclusion. Liberal thought developed in a manner by the 19th century that it identified state and society as legitimate grounds, legitimate locations for activist intervention. And thus, I would say that it laid the foundations of what we today identify as the wokeness or the advocacy tendency. Wokeness and advocacy tendency do the same, that they treat state and society as legitimate locations for continuous activist interventions. Now, to take the story forward, Thomas Hill Green had, of course, raised liberal thought to a more radical register. Simultaneously, by the end of the 19th century, there arrived on the scene a modulation or mutation of liberalism, a new system of thought which actually, to a considerable degree, derived from liberalism. It was a derivative of liberalism in many ways. What was this new system of thought? Today, we know this new system of thought as Marxism. Marxism actually was, to a considerable extent, as I said already, to a considerable extent, a derivative or a modulation of liberal thought, because it creatively worked with a certain liberal notion. Take, for instance, the liberal notion that the state is a guarantor of private property. Karl Marx creatively worked with this idea to argue instead that the state is actually the manifestation of a property form. He argued that a state is a manifestation of the bourgeois institution of a private property. And of course, as you must be familiar, he thereon went on to argue that a considerable portion, a considerable chunk of the Western societies, namely the working class, would be liberated only when this institution of private property and the production relations based upon this institution are abolished. That would also mean the abolition of the traditional European state as it existed then. So, like a liberal thought, like traditional liberal thought, as it had come to be by the 19th century, Marxism too identified the state as a site requiring activist intervention, very radical activist intervention. And once again, like liberal thought, Marxism too critiqued the traditional human social affections. For instance, the institution of marriage, which was, like J.S. Mill, critiqued by Marx's intellectual companion, Engels. Engels critiqued the institution of marriage in his essay, Origins of State, Family and Private Property. I hope I got the title right. However, this was a slightly different critique in the sense that one could term J.S. Mill's critique an ideal one, in the sense that his critique was rooted in an assessment of the Christian marriage vows, a negative assessment of the Christian marriage vows. Frederick Engels, on the other hand, did what we can call, which they termed, Marx and Engels termed, a materialistic critique of the institution of marriage. Engels argued that the institution of marriage, or monogamous marriage, is an outcome of private property. And it originated because men had to establish a paternity, or society at large had to establish a paternity, because men now had their private possessions, their private property to pass on to their descendants. They wanted to identify their legitimate descendants, and that is why this institution of monogamous marriage. It was, as I've said already, it was an outcome of, according to Engels, the institution of private property. And earlier, when Marx and Engels had co-authored the Communist Manifesto, they had identified the bourgeois family, the traditional bourgeois family, as an institution that required dismantling or abolition, if I remember correctly. It was one of their revolutionary agendas. So once again, one can see that the traditional social affections, the institution of monogamous marriage, the traditional monogamous conjugality, is being critiqued by Marxism. It is again a reflection of a liberal thought upon Marxism, which makes Marxism a more radical inflection of liberalism. So like liberalism, once again, to reprise the argument that I'm making here, like liberalism, Marxism too identified the state and society as sites, as locations requiring activist intervention. But I've also repeatedly emphasized that Marxism was a more radical inflection of liberalism. It was so in the sense that from the Marxist point of view, this activist intervention was not a matter of choice. In liberal thought, probably it was a matter of choice, but in Marxism, it wasn't a matter of choice. It was actually a necessity. As understood by Marx and Engels, it was a necessity in the light of their ostensibly materialist interpretation of history or scientific interpretation of history. A lot of Marxist savagery, barbarity, originates or is rooted in this supposedly scientific interpretation of history. But we shall talk about that on some other occasion. So what is happening as a result of this? I would say that the foundations of what we today term wokeness, what we today identify as activist culture, were being strengthened further. First, the foundations were laid by liberal thought, by classical liberal thought, and later these foundations were strengthened further by Marxism. And very soon, at the turn of the 20th century, well, actually by the second decade of the 20th century, the first truly woke state, the first truly activist state came into existence. It was inspired by Marxist philosophy. What was this state? It was the Bolshevik state. It was post-revolutionary Russia. So what happened with the coming into existence of the Bolshevik state was that activist interventions were elevated to the level of state administration. Now they were directed below from the top. While earlier these interventions were probably made by individuals. And interestingly enough, this is something that you might notice, interestingly enough, while Marx had visualized a gradual withering away of the state in the wake of a communist revolution, Bolsheviks actually created an exaggerated state. They created an inflated state which intervened practically in every human activity. It intervened in every form of human association and endeavor and tried to control or re-engineer it. Of course, supposedly to bring about the millennium, to bring about general happiness. But of course, in reality, what was done was that remarkable, terrible, the most awful atrocities were inflicted on large masses of human beings as a result of this tendency of the Soviet state. Anyway, the argument now that I'm presenting before you at this point, at this juncture in my talk, is that we can understand the Soviet state, which I've called the first woke state, as an exaggerated state, as an excessive state. And if you look at wokeness today, if you look at the activist tendency today, you would see that it tends in the same direction. It tends in the direction of creating an exaggerated state, an inflated state. Because wokeness or the activist tendency demands that the state intervene in every realm, in every human affair. From the number of genders that we attribute to human beings, supposedly, well, it is said that there are allegedly 60 or 70 genders today, to the personal pronouns that we employ for these 60 or 70 genders. Wokeness or the activist tendency demands the state's attention in every matter, and it demands state intervention in every matter. So what it does is that it inflates the legislative and supervisory functions of the state and creates an inflated state. And actually, it has been done to a considerable extent in parts of Western Europe. For example, Sweden would be an instance of such a state. Canada would be another instance of such a state. And I would say that the predecessor of such states was the Soviet state. It did similar. It intervened in every human endeavor, every human activity, in practically every aspect of a human life. It was an inflated and exaggerated state. It was a woke state. And similarly, like the Soviet president, wokeness or the activist tendency is creating inflated and exaggerated states in parts of the world. To continue with the narrative, wokeness or the activist tendency, the roots of which I have traced in classical liberalism and later in Marxism, wokeness or the activist tendency began to permeate academia. And the first activist academic was probably Max Horkheimer. He was the director of the Institute for Social Research at Frankfurt, Germany. This place is also popularly known as the Frankfurt School. In 1937, Max Horkheimer wrote a pamphlet. It was titled Traditional and Critical Theory, and I would term this pamphlet the manifesto for activist academia. Horkheimer argued that traditional theory is applied in social production. And he visualized a different kind of theory to counter that. He visualized a kind of theory by which he meant knowledge production, which would be distrustful of the societal rules of conduct and expose the societal contradictions to engineer change. In other words, in simple language, Max Horkheimer visualized an activist form of knowledge production, which we see all around in academia today, by the way. The academic, or most academics these days, by default are activists, critiquing the societies and trying to turn their societies in a more progressive direction, allegedly, supposedly turn their societies in a more progressive direction. So as visualized by Max Horkheimer, the academic had now to double moonlight as an activist. He visualized, or he reimagined the academic as an activist. And here it must be pointed out that Max Horkheimer and his colleagues at the Institute for Social Research or at the Frankfurt School were all Marxists, and they did considerable critiques of Western cultural production from the Marxist materialist point of view, terming it a handmaiden of the capitalist economy. So they were actually the precursors, they were the pioneers of what we today call cultural Marxism. So the cultural Marxist tendency identified newer and newer sites requiring activist intervention or remedial correction. It inflated the woke tendency, and it brought the woke tendency into academia. No aspect of human existence, once again, was spared, definitely from the cultural point of view. To give you one example, Max Horkheimer co-authored an article, co-authored a pamphlet with his colleague at the Institute for Social Research. His name was Theodor Adorno, and the name of this article was On the Fetish Character in Music and Regression in Listening. This pamphlet or this article came out in 1938. Simply put, the two argued that music, as it was produced and performed in the West, had come to be an occasion to promote commodity consumption, and that listening had termed regressive. Human beings preferred the music that they were comfortable with and preferred to listen to this music repeatedly, again and again. So academia, or cultural Marxist academia, now provided fresher terrains, newer and newer terrains for advocacy. The likes of Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer brought the woke tendency, the activist tendency into academia. And of course, once again, let me re-emphasize the roots of this tendency lie in classical Marxism and liberalism. Exactly when did wokeness or the activist tendency become a general thing, mass thing? As understood by me, as indicated by my researches and the readings that I've undertaken, I would say that wokeness or the activist tendency became a mass thing in the late 1960s with the emergence of a new demographic, which we today remember as the New Left. The New Left emerged in the late 1960s, and it comprised lone wolf Marxists. And these were people who were disillusioned with traditional Marxism, which required a party affiliation. And the reason for this disillusionment were the moral failures of Soviet communism, the brutalities of Soviet communism, which came to light at the 20th Party Congress when Nikita Khrushchev confessed to the crimes committed by Joseph Stalin. And to point out another brutality, another moral failure of Soviet communism, which inspired the New Left, the Soviet Union crushed pro-reform governments in Hungary and Czechoslovakia in 1956 and 1968. So the Soviet Union turned out to be as much an imperialist force across the globe as the United States of America, and that disillusioned a lot of denizens, a lot of inhabitants of the political left. So they turned lone wolf Marxists. They were opposed to the brutalities of Soviet communism, or they were embittered on account of the brutalities of Soviet communism, and they avoided party affiliations. But at the same time, they were broadly, loosely committed to Marxism. They were broadly, loosely committed to the left. What did they do? These people, the New Left, the inhabitants of the New Left, took up advocacy of various sorts, and mostly cultural and social advocacy. For example, they They campaigned for the acceptance of the sexual minorities. They critiqued, once again, what I would term the traditional social affections. They critiqued the traditional nuclear family and the gender roles that it created. So wokeness, once again, let me re-emphasize, by the late 1960s, tended to become a mass thing, a general thing. And that was on account of the failures of Soviet communism. And who were these folks, by the way? Largely, generally, these were young people, students in the 18 to 25 or 18 to 30 age group who attended college and university. So wokeness had become a truly manifest phenomenon. By this time, a new trend, a new fashion was catching on in academia, and it was a new line of thought. We call it a postmodernism. Wokeness, as it was becoming a general thing, as it was becoming a mass thing, was considerably buttressed, considerably instigated by postmodernism. So now that I have walked you through the roots, the origins of wokeness, and how it became a general thing, I would now turn in the direction of postmodernism and take up postmodernism. I would now very briefly walk you through the history of postmodernism and try to establish how it articulated with, how it combined with wokeness, and how it spurred and instigated wokeness. So what are the roots? What are the origins of postmodernism? Postmodernism originated as various kinds of nomenclatural play, various kinds of play with language, various kinds of verbal play. To the extent that I'm aware of the origins of postmodernism, the term postmodern, the term postmodernity was probably first used by a poet by the name of Federico da Onís in the 1930s. I'm unsure about his nationality. He wrote his poetry in Spanish, but probably he was an American citizen. By the way, this information is coming from a very slim volume authored by Perry Anderson, Origins of Postmodernity. That is where I got all this information. So to resume the narrative, the term postmodern or postmodernity was very likely used by the Spanish poet Federico da Onís in the 1930s. And what did he mean by this term? He meant a conservative reflex or a conservative tendency, which he identified in contemporary literary criticism. Then again, the term postmodern was used by the British historian Arnold Toynbee, but he attributed to this term a very different meaning altogether. As understood by Toynbee, postmodern meant the age, the contemporary age when the bourgeoisie had lost its hegemony. Then again, the term postmodern or postmodernity was used by the poet Charles Olson. By postmodernity, Charles Olson meant the time after, subsequent to the age of discoveries and the Industrial Revolution. Then once again, the term was used by C. Wright Mills, a sociologist, and Irving Hope, a literary critic. And by this term, the two both meant the collapse of liberalism and socialism. Postmodern was employed by Charles Jenks. He was a cultural theorist and a historian of architecture. And by this term, he meant an age of a superfluity and superabundance, when all binaries had collapsed. Binaries such as working class and capitalist, or left wing and right wing, had collapsed. This is the meaning that he attributed to the term postmodern. So we can see the varieties of verbal play that the term, or nomenclatural play that the term postmodern was occasioning once upon a time. The term was given a certain fixity or stability for the first time in the 1970s, I think at some point in the late 1970s, 77 or 78 probably, by Jean Lyotard in his pamphlet or very slim volume that he authored, The Postmodern Condition. Jean Lyotard theorized or understood the postmodern as an incredulity for grand narratives. By the postmodern, he meant that grand narratives had lost their credibility or their viability. And how did he try to establish this argument? He tried to establish this argument by citing the example of science or the grand narrative of science. He argued in this pamphlet that once upon a time, science was seen as the emancipator of the human mind, as the liberator of the human mind. It liberated the human mind from priestly tyranny and religious dogma. That was the worth, that was the value of science. However, Lyotard said that in the contemporary age, the worth, the value of science did not lie in that. Allegedly, as understood by him, that the grand narrative, that meta-narrative of science had lost its credibility. So, science was no more considered worthwhile just because it had liberated the human mind from priestly tyranny and religion. Lyotard thought that in the contemporary age, in the times in which he was living, the worth of science was evaluated from various social and political locations. That is, the worth of science had become a matter of subjectivities. So here is one aspect, one vital aspect of postmodernism, which, as I would later try to establish, contributes to the woke tendency. This aspect of postmodern is the valorization of subjectivities and the rejection of the objective worth of values. We can say that Lyotard rejected the objective value of science, and he tried to argue that the value of science comes from multiple subjectivities, from various multiple social and political locations. So here is one vital aspect of postmodern. I'm repeating myself, the valorization of subjectivities. Moving on, understanding the postmodern further, another theorist, Frederick Jameson, argued or understood that the postmodern means the de-differentiation of cultural spheres. That is, the mingling of high and low cultures. And here I'm paraphrasing Frederick Jameson. This is something that we actually see in the postmodern art, or what is termed postmodern art. It does not have a definite agenda. It does not have definite aesthetic identifiers either. What we see, what we notice in postmodern art is actually a mingling of various artistic tendencies. It displays a tendency for both figuration and abstraction, and the postmodern art also incorporates elements of a popular commercial art. So postmodern art is not marked by one definite visual style. It does not have a definite aesthetic or artistic agenda. So paraphrasing Frederick Jameson further, I would say that the second feature of postmodernity is actually multifarity and mingling, or hybridity. It mingles a lot of things. It is a state of confusion, to put it very simply. First, the valorization of subjectivities, and secondly, multifarity or mingling, deliberate confusion. Then postmodernism has been identified has been understood as the cultural logic of late capitalism by Perry Anderson. These arguments, as I said a while ago, are derived from his book, The Origins of Postmodernity. So Perry Anderson argues in this book that modernism originated as a sort of rebellion, as a sort of reaction against bourgeois values or bourgeois aesthetics. And modernism originated in an age that was the 19th century, that was the second half of the 19th century. Modernism originated in an age when the ruling class, the ruling order was still aristocratic, and the political horizon was replete with revolutionary possibilities. So modernism expressed these revolutionary possibilities. It expressed a certain radicalism. It incorporated political radicalism, and it pitted itself against bourgeois values and bourgeois aesthetics. Think of this trend, Dadaism. It deliberately took on bourgeois aesthetics. However, Perry Anderson argues, or he goes on to argue, that in the 25 odd years subsequent to the Second World War, the bourgeoisie were extinct as a class with a distinct set of values. One could no more speak of bourgeois values in the West. So modernism lost its adversary. There were no more bourgeois values or bourgeois aesthetics dominating art, which it could pit itself against. At the same time, Perry Anderson argues that there was a relative closure of the political horizon. It was no more radical in the West as it was at the end of the 19th century. The labor movement, for example, was tamed. It was diffused. Labor was sort of bribed off with the certain gains of capitalism. Subsequent to the Second World War, we see that labor got relatively prosperous in the Western European countries, and even miners came to own cars and other consumer durables. So the labor movement lost its radical pitch, and capital got hegemonic. So Perry Anderson concludes that postmodernism is actually an outcome of this situation in the Western world, the diffusion of, the diffusing, my apologies, the diffusing of radical political possibilities and the hegemony of capital. And he also points out that postmodernism emerged as a cultural dominant. It got culturally hegemonic, particularly, especially in the Western countries, marked by high levels of consumption and a general hegemony of capital. So what does postmodernism do in Perry Anderson's understanding? As seen by me, it doesn't do much, actually. Once again, Perry Anderson points out that postmodernism generally lacks an agenda, and it displays a tendency for banalization. So it is much ado about nothing, actually. So to conclude, it is nearly 6:30. To conclude, postmodernism contributes to wokeness on account of these two tendencies that I have pointed out during the course of my talk. First, it valorizes subjectivities. What does this mean? It means that when you're assessing the worth of a situation, not with reference to a value set, but from your specific subjectivity, oppression did not be an objective reality. Objective realities do not matter anymore. The experience, the subjective experience or perception of oppression is enough, and that can serve as occasion for activism. For example, one identifies as one of the 60 or 70 odd genders there are about these days, and feels oppressed if personal pronouns are not tailored to suit one's specific subjective gender identity. Secondly, the multifarity and mingling, or the hybridity that characterizes postmodernism and its lack of agenda, its a tendency for banalization, has cut a lot of people adrift in the West. It has cut a lot of people adrift from their cultural moorings, from their value sets, which were anyway being dismantled, which were anyway being destroyed by advanced capitalism. So what happens as a result of this is that there are a lot of people out and about adrift in the Western societies and today in Indian society too. And these people seek social and emotional comfort. And advocacy becomes a way to seek this comfort. It is actually a form of apolitical politics. Advocacy culture gives the appearance of being political, but it is actually not political. It is actually a way to seek personal fulfillment or affirmation for one's subjectivities and personal identities. So here is how, in my opinion, wokeness and postmodernism come together. Here is how they two articulate and create the world that we live in today. It is a very problematic world in many ways. So I conclude my talk here, and I invite questions from you. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Sir, as you told that the postmodern thought was preceded by the end of hegemony of capitalist ideas. So can we say that it was the same time around which the post-materialist thinking evolved? That means they were already so much fulfilled with whatever benefits the capitalism could give them. And so are these two related, the post-materialist and the postmodernist thoughts?
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. Thank you very much for making this observation. There's this individual, there's this academic, he teaches in one of the Western universities, in one of the Ivy League universities, I've forgotten which, I think Columbia, Mark Lilla. So Professor Mark Lilla has written this very interesting book. It is called The One and Future Liberal. I'm getting an echo at my end. So Webber, did you get what I said?
No, sir, I just missed the last sentence.
Yeah. So I said that Professor Mark Lilla has written this very interesting book. It is called The Once and Future Liberal, in which once again he tries to trace the roots, the origins of the current form of liberalism, which is advocacy culture. And Professor Lilla says that it is actually rooted in the suburbs of the suburb culture of the United States of America, as it came to be in the 1960s and 1970s. It was a time of general prosperity in the West, when the Western economies were booming. And there emerged this class, the upper middle class, which moved into the suburbs. where there were no challenges. Nothing really happened. Life was very comfortable. So an entire generation grew up in the American suburbs in the 1960s and 1970s, and their only way to seek personal fulfillment was advocacy. And I suppose that kind of addresses your curiosity. And this is an argument which has been made by another individual. I hope I've been able to address your curiosity. So yes, to take my conclusion, to take my observation further, yes, to an extent, definitely it is a post-materialist tendency. Advocacy is a post-materialist tendency in the sense that it is a tendency displayed by people whose basic material wants were fulfilled at a certain point of time, and they grew up without any material challenges. As I said at the start of this talk, I live in a neighborhood where power cuts are frequent, and I said that it could be that I go suddenly offline at a point in the talk, and that would mean that there's a power cut at my end. But these people who grew up in the American suburbs in the 1960s and 70s had no challenges of this sort. So where did they seek challenges? Where did they seek fulfillment? In advocacy of various kinds.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. Got it.
Thank you. The next question is from Siddhant Dubey. He's asking, sir, you mentioned how Canada and Sweden are a successor of Bolshevik state. Sir, but the traditional preservation of Viking heritage is directly opposite of Marxist idea of progressive, though how can it be seen as a direct successor?
Well, Siddhant, I did not say that Canada and Sweden are successors to the Soviet state, because all said and done, these are democracies, and they give their citizens personal freedom. But I traced their genealogy to the Soviet state in the sense that both are inflated states, both are exaggerated states in the sense that they take a lot of social issues into cognizance, and they take a lot of cultural behavior into cognizance, and they're great deal into cultural engineering. For example, tailoring language use, tailoring personal pronouns to suit gender identities. This is one instance of the interventionist, the culturally, socially interventionist tendency of the state as it is emerging in these places in Canada and Sweden. And this interventionist tendency was displayed by the Soviet Union as well. It engineered, it intervened in every form of human activity, in every form of human endeavor. It intervened even in the philatelist societies. It intervened in literary clubs, in every sort of human activity, human endeavor. So the point that I was trying to make is that wokeness directs the state in such a manner that it gets inflated. It gets exaggerated. Its legislative, its supervisory functions get exaggerated, inflated. And this inflated, exaggerated state has been coming into existence thoroughly, gradually in countries such as Sweden and Canada. And a similar state existed once upon a time in the form of the Soviet Union. So in this sense, I try to connect the two, or rather the three states such as Canada, Sweden, and the Soviet Union. I do not say that Canada and Sweden are direct successors or descendants of the Soviet Union. No, not at all. Not at all. Definitely not. They give their give their citizens, the right to vote, considerable liberties, but they're also getting inflated and exaggerated, just as the Soviet Union was an inflated and exaggerated state in the cultural and in the social sense.
So my question actually relates to two things. One, I don't know if you've already covered this during the course of your talk, but you did mention that Jean Lyotard's definition, or rather understanding of postmodernism, was something to do with being critical of meta or grand narratives, and critical of overall objectivities. So I also sort of find this trend in, say, Derridian way of thinking or Foucauldian way of thinking. How would you then explain the arguably unholy alliance between, say, Marxism, a grand narrative of its own, and postmodernism? Though, like, theoretically, they shouldn't be gelling together, but they seemingly are in the current cultural scheme. That is one question. And the second question pertains to J.S. Mill. Did J.S. Mill's harm principle sort of factor in the potential offense theory that we are currently victims of, in terms of, does it also include the right to sort of me being able to go against you for offending me? Would that also come under the ambit of harm principle, so to speak? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Rakshit, for those kind words. So, to begin with, how does the Marxism meld or mingle with postmodernism? Actually, it doesn't. In the sense that traditional textual Marxists are actually quite extinct. On the university campuses, you come across lots of academics and students who pose as Marxists and leftists. But if you ask them, what is the Marxist definition of commodity or labor? What is the Marxist definition of capital? They wouldn't know. Even the professors wouldn't know. What is the Marxist definition of capital? The Marxist definition of capital is that it is money involved, engaged in commodity circulation. What is the Marxist definition of labor? It is that labor is a combination of mental and physical attributes which are used to produce value. How many students, how many professors posing as Marxists, as leftists, are aware of these definitions today, Rakshit? Have you come across any who are? I don't think so. This is very rare these days. So traditional Marxism is actually more or less extinct today. What we see today in the name of Marxism is the cultural Marxist tendency. It is the tendency to fragment the cultural domain more and more by critiquing the cultural domain from various points of view, generally some materialist point of view. So in this sense, yes, there is a compatibility between cultural Marxism and postmodernism, because postmodernism too is a fragmentary tendency. It takes a very fragmented view of the world. Cultural Marxism too does the same. It identifies more and more fragments. So in this sense, I would agree with you. There is a certain coming together of a certain form of Marxism, not Marxism per se, definitely not traditional Marxism, and postmodernism. It again articulates, it again segues into the post-structuralist tendency, which is represented, of course, by Derrida. Derrida actually represents a certain hermeneutic tendency. What he propounded was a certain hermeneutic agenda, a certain way to do textual criticism, which once again people are not aware of today. Derrida is quoted a lot, but understood very little. I myself do not understand Derrida. Let me confess this before this audience. I have understood Derrida a little, if at all, by reading commentaries on him. So once again, to return to what I was saying, Derrida represents a certain hermeneutic tendency, a way to do textual criticism. And what is the basis, what is the premise of this tendency? The premise is the assumption that there is a continuity between textualization and the speech act. The speech act is unstable, it is prone to yielding multiple meanings. And since there is a continuity between the speech act and textualization, texts too are similarly unstable and prone to yielding multiple meanings. And of course, there's a second premise to Derridian hermeneutics. The premise is that language is not a structure. It does not furnish meanings in the form of a structure. And what this would mean? It would mean that the traditional structuralist assumption that words exist in a language in a relationship of oppositional distinction is not quite true. Meanings are actually quite random, and they come from different cultural subjectivities. This once again feeds into the activist woke tendency, because woke activists employing the Derridian hermeneutics deconstruct language and use, or rather establish language as another side requiring activist intervention, which is why Rakshit, please do notice this woke tendency to sanitize language, to tailor language to suit different, in their opinion, what are the different cultural requirements, that we sanitize language of its various cultural prejudices, of the various power asymmetries. And we also tailor language so that it it assumes a more progressive appearance. We either tailor the personal pronouns or create newer and newer personal pronouns to express the gender realities. And finally, coming to the harm principle, well, Rakshit, I'm not quite familiar with it. Is it something that you read in legal theory? Because I've not come across it in J.S. Mill to the extent that I've read J.S. Mill.
So, Professor, so it's basically the idea that you can wave your fist as much as you want to, as long as you don't hit the other person in the face.
Okay.
The idea of, let's say, J.S. Mill's idea of sort of how rights need to be enjoyed by society and the adjacent responsibilities come along with it. So I'm wondering that.
Oh yes, yes. I get it now. I right. Understand what you're talking about. It is actually J.S. Mill's understanding of individuality.
Right.
J.S. Mill thought that human character, human personality develops the best through personal freedom. And as I said during the course of my talk as well, he believed that society need not enjoy or ought not to enjoy authority over a human being as long as that human being is not acting inimical to society, to the social body. I think that is what you are referring to here. That one can wave one's fist about as much as possible, but as long as one is not causing harm to anyone, the social body or the state need not intervene. I think that is what you're talking about here.
Right. So, but I'm actually taking a little further with Thomas Greenhill's sort of idea of radicalizing that notion. Would that extend to not just mere hindering other person's enjoyment of the rights, but to the point of harming, considering even merely offending someone through speech as merely as harming them? The violation of J.S. Mill's liberalism to an extent.
Oh yes, definitely. There's a certain reimagining of what is harm, and when exactly you're harming another human being. So this reimagining is making the notion of harm or what constitutes harm more and more delicate. And this is something that you notice on social media. People are out and about on social media with a very delicate notion of what constitutes a harm or what constitutes an offense, and they're offended very easily indeed. So I would say that there is a certain reimagining of the notion of harm.
Yes, all right, I get it.
Thank you, Professor Dey.
Thank you.
A wonderful answer, and I hope that it satisfies Rakshit.
Perfectly, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. The next question is from Shashank Shaurya Dubey. He's asking, sir, do you see an evolution of wokeness in present times towards fulfilling a larger political agenda? Is it moving beyond the idea of personal fulfillment?
Well, wokeness is very dangerous because it does not have a coherent agenda. It does not operate with a coherent value set. The very basis of wokeness is a rejection of value sets or a rejection of the objective value of value sets, which is also why wokeness is so dangerous, because it is a fragmenting tendency. It is a fragmentary tendency. It tries to fragment a society, the social body, as much as possible. And what happens as a default on account of this tendency is an exaggeration of the state, because the more the social body is fragmented, for example, let us say Hindus are fragmented more and more along cultural lines, along gender and so forth. What would happen? The state would get inflated more and more. And a society could be controlled to any extent. A society could be controlled, engineered, or re-engineered to any extent by this inflated state. For example, the state would direct how temples are to be run, who gets to enter the temple, or whether certain taboos are to be observed in temples or not. In certain states, in certain conditions. I hope you understand that I'm referring to the Sabarimala issue. So the more the social body is fragmented by the woke tendency and the activist tendency, the more the state gets inflated. And this is why the woke tendency is so dangerous. It is also dangerous because people engaged in this tendency, manifesting this tendency, operate from extreme subjectivities. They either do not want to or are simply not literate enough to see a broader picture as to what is happening on account of their interventions. So yes, as you said, this tendency is is a way, is a means to find a personal fulfillment for a lot of people. But this fulfillment does not use a definite value set as its datum. Any kind of personal fulfillment which is not morally oriented is inherently dangerous, in my opinion. So this is my response to your question.
Thank you, Professor Dey. It's wonderful. I think one beautiful explanation. The next question is from MK. He's asking, what is the trajectory of postmodern socio-cultural politics in India, and particularly in hegemonic institutions like JNU? He's already describing the institutions, given the control of power and reactionary interventions by the Indian state.
Control of power and reactionary interventions. I do not see any reactionary interventions. In fact, if there are reactionary interventions, they come from this so-called radical mass, the woke mass, and the left. They're reactionary in the sense that they are actually very intolerant of opinions which they do not agree with, and they're also very elitist. In this sense, definitely they're very reactionary. So what they represent is a kind of elite fascism. In fact, I tried to make this point in an article I wrote a long time ago in 2017, that both liberalism as it exists today and communism are actually forms of elite reaction. So this woke activist mass, in my opinion, represents a kind of elite reaction, and it is also fundamentally fascist because it is very dismissive of opinions which it disagrees with, and it is also very dismissive of genuinely progressive opinions, which try to orient state and society in a more progressive direction with reference to a definite value set. These people, of course, reject all value sets. But I think if we are to be genuinely progressive, it has to be a moral progression towards a better future. Any immoral activism is very dangerous in my opinion, and these people are very immoral. So no, the state is not making reactionary interventions in this mass. This mass in itself is reactionary. The level of personal freedom and academic freedom that we enjoy in India is actually immense. I don't think any other third world society enjoys such freedom as we do in India. So we ought to cherish the freedom that we have and use it well.
I just want to ask a question that is related to culture. Like you have very comprehensively unpacked how the Enlightenment liberalism started criticizing the cultural values and following the tradition. The cultural Marxists also, follow the same path. Of course, their political goals were quite different from each other. So my understanding with regards to what you have mentioned, that why they have been able to criticize or in a way attack the cultural values, there must be some rational ground, as pointed out by the author of the book Bharsu of Nationalism, Yoram Hazuni. So there must be some rational ground, like the cultural exploitation in the name of culture, or some superstition, etc., etc. So my point is, if Indian civilization or Indian culture is facing the tremendous kind of criticism, or you can say attack, from the cultural Marxist or from the Enlightenment liberalist, so there must be some rational ground that enable them to capture this space. So would you mind to point out that the cultural practices from a perspective? That is my question, Dada.
Thank you, Gurcharan. I think I have been able to understand your question. So let me try and respond to it. So to begin with, why did these thinkers attack the cultural values as they prevailed in the West in the 19th century or at the start of the 20th century? Why did the Marxists, for example, attack the prevalent cultural values? To put it very simply, sorry, to put it very simply, it was an account of their understanding of culture, which was, in their opinion, an aspect of the superstructure of society, that is, the ideological formation of society. And this ideological formation, or the superstructure as they called it, was rooted in the production relations, which were inherently oppressive, which were inherently asymmetrical, in the sense that these were based on the hegemony of a capital. And the classes which formed these production relations were the workers and the capitalists. And the capitalists were, of course, superior. They alienated surplus value from the working class. So this is the reason why, to begin with, Marxism attacked the cultural values and the social formation as it existed in Europe in the 19th century. Then again, in the 20th century, or at the start of the 20th century, Marxism was inflected slightly differently. It assumed this cultural orientation. And then again, the cultural values and the traditional social formation were attacked. This was done, for example, by Gramsci, and Gramsci slightly modified the traditional Marxist notions, slightly modified the traditional Marxist understanding of culture to argue that the culture actually subserves or aids the production relations, the traditional capitalist production relations, that states acculturate their populations so that they become useful from the point of view of the capitalist production relations. That is, states impart numeracy and literacy to their populations so that they can be good workers. So I'm making 2 points here. First, traditional Marxism, for example, made a very negative assessment of culture as a manifestation of superstructure, and the superstructure was rooted in inherently oppressive production relations. And secondly, the 20th century, a Marxist such as Gramsci argued that the traditional culture or traditional social formations actually aid and subserve the capitalist production relations, which once again were inherently, as understood by them, were inherently oppressive and inherently iniquitous. This is why, to begin with, Marxism attacked culture. And of course, Marxism created its Indian imitators, and they came to dominate academia post-independence. They came to be hegemonic in academia post-independence. And they made the materialist interpretation of Indian history, especially ancient Indian history. And from the point of view of this interpretation, ancient India was the site of all sorts of atrocities and oppression. So they made a very negative assessment of Indian history and the culture that emerged therefrom. So this is how you can see the links. Traditional Marxism in the 19th century made a very negative assessment of culture. Then Marxism argued that culture actually subserves the traditional iniquitous production relations, and the Indian imitators, basing their opinions on the materialist interpretation of history, argued that, ancient India and the subsequent history of India is rife with oppression, and naturally, on account of the production relations or the social formations, oppressive social formations which existed in ancient India and in the subsequent centuries, the culture that existed therefrom was also inherently oppressive. It disenfranchised, socially disenfranchised a lot of people. So that is why their attack on Indian culture, their dismissal of Indian culture.
Good evening, sir. So, first of all, thank you for this wonderful talk. And what I understand from the talk is that obviously these theories have emerged in a particular context, which is mainly the Western Christian context, and they have emerged as critiques of the Western societies. So, but what we notice on our campuses today, and I think this has been the trend since independent India has came into being, that these theories have been directly imported without considering the suitability of these theories on our campuses or in our society in general. So just one thing that I wanted to ask was regarding how suitable would be wokeness for say the agenda of the colonized societies, And in this sense, I don't mean wokeness in the sense of postmodernism or the wokeness which you notice in Western societies. Here, by wokeness, I mean raising legitimate concerns. So, say for example, if we witness in our societies today, say the denial of Hindu genocides throughout history,
Yeah.
shouldn't we be raising these legitimate concerns everywhere, including the social media, including taking up with the state, etc., etc.? And obviously, it is very difficult to chalk out a proper defined line as to where do we begin and where do we stop. But then again, like, what are your views on this?
Thank you very much, Yeshuvardhan, for asking this question. So wokeness is the advocacy tendency, and it is also a critical tendency. It pretends to be a critical tendency. Now, my opinion is that any critical tendency to be moral must be consistent. And I said a little while ago that wokeness or this advocacy tendency is immoral. This is one of the reasons. Let me come to it. This is one of the reasons why I consider this advocacy tendency of wokeness immoral. If it is to be seen as a critical tendency, it is very inconsistent. For example, a little while ago, when responding to Gurucharan, I said that the Indian imitators of Marxism and the Indian imitators who also took up the materialist interpretation of history interpreted or understood ancient India in very negative terms, and the culture that emerged therefrom in negative terms. They argued, they insinuated that the social formation which existed then and the production relations which existed then culturally disenfranchised a lot of people, namely the Shudras and the women. So these people, the Indian Marxists, for example, conceded, or rather they insinuated repeatedly, that ancient India was rife with abuse and atrocity of every kind, and the cultural character of ancient India or the ancient Indian state disenfranchised a lot of people. But moving on, coming to medieval India, they did not say as much. It is as though the state in medieval India did not have a culture. It did not have a cultural personality, as though it did not disenfranchise any people in any manner. But it did, definitely. The cultural agency of Hindus in the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal state was considerably reduced, in my opinion. There were phases, there were durations in which Hindus could not construct a temple, so they could not, they could not repair their old temples. For example, Shah Jahan declared that Hindus must not repair their old temples, and later Aurangzeb, at a point in his rule, if I remember correctly, my specialization is not medieval India. If I remember correctly, he declared that Hindus may not construct new temples. So the medieval Indian state definitely, to a certain degree, culturally disenfranchised Hindus. So the problem with academia is that its critical tendencies are not consistent. They balk at the doors, they stop at the doors of medieval India, while they go simply berserk in ancient India. So, Yeshuvardhan, this is the problem that I identify. The materialist interpretation of history is applied very commonly, and it's applied very, very randomly, unsuitably too, definitely very unsuitably in ancient India, when academics make interpretations of ancient India and ancient Indian culture, but they do not apply it in medieval India. They do not do any cultural critiques of medieval India, and they would never concede that the medieval Indian state, the Mughal state, culturally reduced or culturally disenfranchised the Hindus in any manner on account of how it was formed and on account of how it functioned. For example, the major positions in Mughal India, barring rare exceptions here and there, and were not awarded to Hindus. And I've already said that the cultural agency of Hindus too was considerably reduced in Mughal India, but they would not make these concessions. So if it is a critical tendency that they display, it is an immoral tendency because it is not consistent. I hope I've been able to address your question, understand your question, and address it.
Right, sir. So basically what I was trying to say was that how suitable would the woke agenda, or sorry, I think I should put it like this. say, for example, if there is a denial of Hindu genocide, as you yourself are saying that there wasn't, there hasn't been a sustained cultural critique of the medieval period,
Yeah.
and obviously it's very like one can notice that there has been consistent denial of Hindu genocides as well. So, say, for example, if the colonized people, that is the Hindus themselves,
Yeah.
take it up on themselves and start protesting it in some sense, just as the woke people do. So, should we be accused of wokeism, or would it be a legitimate agenda?
No, Yashowardhan, in this case, this is not a subjectivity. And this is not a subjectivity. It's a historical fact. As I've said, the cultural agency of Hindus was indeed reduced in the Mughal state, and Hindus were indeed culturally disenfranchised. So this is a historical fact, in my opinion, and irrefutable historical fact. But the problem with the other side is that they do not concede this historical fact. So we are not woke if we take up this point, if we make this point. Definitely not, because we are not operating from a subjectivity. Here in this case, there is an objective historical reality that we are referring to. But what we have to do is that we have to establish this reality on the concrete foundations of evidence. Getting emotional in these matters or getting angry in these matters will not help. Of course, when you point this out on social media to the other side, to the woke side, and this is what happened to Hindus, that they were culturally disenfranchised in the Mughal state, they would not agree with you. But the solution in this case is not to abuse, never do that. The solution in this situation is not to get angry. What we have to do is that we have to establish this concrete historical reality on the foundations of facts. That is what we have to do. We are not woke if we make this point, because I repeat, this is not an imaginary subjectivity that we are talking about. I'm not saying that I belong to gender Z or gender X and use a certain personal pronoun for me. I'm not imagining anything here. I'm referring to an objective historical reality. There are these firmans of Aurangzeb, there are these firmans of Shah Jahan, which say that Hindus cannot repair their temples, or they cannot construct new temples.
So actually, you were talking about how the entire understanding of folk culture can be a post-materialist project as such. But don't you really think it really has an ideational basis as well, which can go back to the understanding of materiality? Like if we talk about multiple genders, innumerable genders, we do have patriarchy, and then the understanding of material culture, kind of arising or emerging from them. So don't you really think? Don't you really think it is problematic to establish it as a post-materialist culture, if we can call woke culture a kind of a proper discipline? And my second question is, we also understand that when we talk about wokeness, there are certain statements which are immediately accepted, whereas the other statements are not. I mean, I'm talking about the cancel culture that is very, very prevalent in wokeness as such. So don't you really think there is some kind of a moral objective ethos in the kind of herd culture or swarm culture that comes out of this understanding of wokeness, in place of varied and innumerable proliferating subjectivity?
Well, and I'll disagree with you on both counts. Wokeness is indeed a post-materialistic, mental state in the sense that it doesn't refer much to the material world. Its datum is actually imagination. This is something that we were talking about a while ago. Now, talking of genders, for example, or talking of sexes, I disagree that the genders or sexes are pure social constructs. What society does is creatively work with biological and hormonal realities. There are truly, genuinely hormonal differences between human males and human females, and males and females in every species. What we do in our society is to creatively work with these differences. There are certain aspects of masculinity which are restricted. For example, the random application of muscular strength, from childhood, from boyhood, male children are asked not to get into fights. So there are certain aspects, biological sides to ourselves, which are restricted, and there are certain sides which are moralized, which are even inflated. The point that I'm basically making is that genders, sexes are indeed rooted in biology and hormonal differences. What society does is to creatively work with these differences, to creatively restrain or creatively inflate these differences in certain circumstances and contexts. You may agree or disagree with this reality. That's a different matter. You may approve or disapprove of this reality, but this is what reality is, in my opinion. But in case of 2 or at most 3 or 4 genders, if you are saying that there are 60 or 70 genders, you have to furnish concrete evidence. You have to point out on what hormonal basis you are imagining, you are arguing, you're postulating these genders. The 2 dominant hormones creating gender differences in human beings or in other species, 2 are testosterone and estrogen. But if you're saying that there are 65 or 79 genders, you have to tell me on what hormonal basis these genders exist. Because I know of only 2 dominant hormones, male and female hormones, testosterone and estrogen. But if you're arguing that there are 79 genders, you have to tell me what are these hormones and that are creating these genders. So imagining or arguing that there are 65 or 79 or 85 genders is just that. It is a pure imagination, and it is a post-materialist imagination which does not hearken to physical sciences, which does not listen to biology. It is a post-biological imagination from the purely scientific point of view. And once again, the same with the cancel culture, that you're getting offended continuously by this or that. Let us say you're getting offended by a Mozart composition, a keyboard composition. It is called a rondo, spelled R-O-N-D-O. It is called a rondo alla turca, rondo like the Turks. But you listen to this composition and say that this is Islamophobic because it has a very rapid tempo, and allegedly, the rapid tempo is inspired by the charge of the Turkish cavalry. And you say that, Mozart was being Islamophobic here. But the problem with this argument is that you have to establish exactly how. It is not a vocal composition. It is a keyboard composition which does not take the aid of lyrics. No lyrics are set to this composition. So if you say that this composition is Islamophobic, it is a pure imagination, because it is not that Mozart is furthering a certain worldview through this composition. It is just a certain tempo that it is using, that it is deploying to create a certain emotional and aural effect. Once again, moving on, let us say that you get offended by a certain author. You get offended by Oscar Wilde. I think there is this story. Well, I remember there's this story by him, Little Infanta's Birthday, which is about this princess who is very insensitive. She's a princess after all, and she's a spoiled brat. So one day they bring a dwarf to play with her, and she plays with the dwarf all through the day. And the dwarf imagines that. The princess is in love with her, and later he discovers that it was all imagination. The princess did not love him after all. She was just treating him as a source of, as a means of amusement. And when the dwarf discovers this, realizes this, he dies of heartbreak. You read this story and say that, that Oscar Wilde is being misogynist here, because he portrays the princess as being very insensitive, and B, he is mocking someone's disability. Here's a dwarf after all, and he's being very insensitive to the dwarf. You have to tell me exactly how, because I don't see that. I think this story by Wilde is actually a plea for sensitivity. He would like princesses to be more empathetic towards people with a different physical condition. So the problem with wokeness, Ayan, is that it does not furnish evidence in most circumstances, in most contexts. It just pushes a certain agenda, it just pushes a certain argument and expects people to accept it just like that. The problem here is that, to identify another problem, the problem here is that it is a very pre-enlightenment, pre-reason, pre-rationality. It functions purely on the basis of emotions. The fuel of woke culture is emotionalism, random emotionalism. It is not fact, it is not evidence, it is not arguments. I hope I've been able to address your question, Ayan.
Yes, thank you.
postmodernists are like tentacles of Hydra. It's very difficult to distinguish them now. They come in all shapes and sizes. Or is deconstruction as a method of analyzing things, counting in perspectives, reserved solely for postmodernists and cultural Marxists? I see all of us employing these methods. Is this not their ultimate victory?
Yes, in a way, definitely. Wokeness has earned a victory in the sense that it has gotten rather hegemonic in academia, and that is because it is not challenged. And yes, a lot of us are employing these deconstruction techniques too when we study texts. So what is the solution? The solution is to deploy facts. The solution is to deploy evidence against this deconstructionist tendency and to deploy a method, because the deconstructionist tendency does not suggest a method. It does not leave you with a method. You are just left to your own devices, and you're free to use whatever form of emotionalism that is dominating you at a particular point of time. I'd referred to Derrida a while ago while responding to a question, and I'd said that he argues, or the insinuation that he makes is that the textualization or the text is an extension of the speech act, but it does not say exactly how. What are the connectors between the speech act and textualization? Exactly how is this connection established? What is his method? On what premises is he making this argument? This is the fundamental deficiency with the deconstruction, with the Derridian deconstruction. The deficiency is that it is all about random insinuations and random insights and supposed insights, which do not require, which do not refer to facts and evidence. And on account of this, Derridian deconstruction is not refutable. And if it is not refutable, in my opinion, it is not knowledge. I was reading Schopenhauer just the other day, yesterday actually, and he says an abridgment of world as will and representation. And at a point he says that knowledge is representations. Knowledge is the world of representations. Yes, it is indeed true. But the thing with these representations is that these representations are refutable. They can be bettered. They can be improved upon. How do you refute Derridian deconstruction? Let us say I say a harmless sentence. I speak this sentence or write this sentence, and the cow eats grass. And adopting, assuming the Derridian point of view, the deconstructionist point of view, you say that I'm promoting Islamophobia. And the grass is green in color and the cow is sacred to Hindus. You say that I'm actually promoting Islamophobia or I'm motivating Islamophobia in speaking the sentence. But you have to tell me how. What is the basis of this argument? If you said as much, it is only on the basis of your emotionalism. It is a pure emotional response to what I remarked. And this is not knowledge. This is not a science. It's nothing. It's just emotionalism, random emotionalism. And this is my problem with the deconstructionist tendency and a lot of wokeness, which derives inspiration from the deconstructionist tendency. It is eating away at academia, actually. It is considerably hegemonic in academia, and the solution to it is only a resuscitation of reason, rationality, and old style fact-based teaching. This is my response. This is all that I can.
Very good. So, alternative solution, maybe as proposed by you, I think we can try to follow that. It was a lovely talk. I think you captured all these points in sufficient detail, and you covered a very wide spectrum of this whole evolution of the thought of wokeness and how this modern thought has evolved over so many centuries in the Western sphere, thought sphere.
And thank you, Ankur. It was great interacting with this audience and getting to express my views on this theme. It is very close to my heart, and as I said, I've been exploring it, investigating it for some time. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. The questions were really great. The most incisive, intelligent questions I've dealt with in a long time. So thank you very much, audience, for posing these questions. You really made me think today. Thanks a lot.